Deadlock has just received the matchmaking update, and I think it was a massive success. There are a few minor things that I'm still concerned about, but those are things that could possibly be addressed in Season 2, so I'm going to hold off complaining about them until we actually get there. Instead, what I want to talk about is something a little more exciting. What's next for Deadlock? Yoshi has said that after the matchmaking update, there are two major updates that the team is working on. An item update and a content update. So today, I want to go through what I would personally like to see in both of them. Let's start with the item update. This one is very vague as to what it could be, and obviously I don't have any concrete information, so everything I say is just speculation on my part. But we do know that Valve has hired the Risk of Rain 2 devs, and we've had a bunch of hints and leaks about some kind of PvE game mode coming to Deadlock. And if I had to put money down, I would say that PvE mode will be some kind of wave defense, where you're fighting enemies, earning currency, and buying items in between waves until you complete all the waves, or possibly it's an endless mode where you just try and get as far as possible. But if they're going to do this, they're going to need to create some new items for PvE anyways, so this would be a really good opportunity to take a look at all the PvP items at the same time. And if I had to guess, the item update will not just be an item update. I bet that we'll be getting the PvE game mode alongside with the item rework. Now, an item update could mean a lot of different things. It could be something like adding a bunch of new items and reworking or rebalancing some of the existing ones. Or it could be something much bigger where they completely rework how the investment system works. We really don't know. And that's what makes this update so exciting. Personally, I'd love to see them use this opportunity to experiment with how players build their characters and create more meaningful choices between different playstyles. As an example, I'd love to see ability charges get reworked. I actually just made a video on this exact topic, so definitely go check that video out after this. I genuinely think that is one of my best videos I've made, but moving on. The content update. Now, obviously, the most important thing I want to see here is more heroes. I mean, this is a hero shooter we're playing, so give me more characters to play as. As a support main, I'd obviously love to see more support heroes added, but I also think we're somewhat lacking in the tank department as well. But there's another archetype that I really want to see the Deadlock devs experiment with. Proper mage. Now, I know you could argue that Paige and Sinclair already fill that role, and I can kind of see that argument, but I would personally consider them more support-oriented characters. What I want is a full-on DPS caster. And I know someone is probably going to say, but this is a shooter, why would you want an archetype that typically doesn't use a gun? And to that argument I say, 1, we already have an auto-aim summoner and a turret hero, and 2, who said they wouldn't use their gun? Take Paige for an example. Paige is a caster character, so Valve clearly has shown that they know how to make a caster character work in a shooter game. There are a lot of different playstyles and archetypes that still haven't been tried in Deadlock, and a traditional mage is one that I would absolutely love to see. In fact, I thought about how one would actually work in-game. The basic idea would be that their ability changes what their gun does. So for example, you press their first ability, and suddenly their gun becomes a simple skill shot. Think something vaguely similar to Pocket's Barrage, although obviously completely different numbers and mechanics. Then you use a second ability, and it changes your gun into a low damage shot that bounces from one target to another. Kind of like how Celeste gun can bounce to another target. The important part is the character would still be using their gun and ammo, but because Deadlock doesn't have a resource other than cooldowns, ammo would essentially act as mana. Different abilities could consume different amounts of ammo, forcing you to actually manage your resources. This way, you still get the feeling of playing a mage character while still having to interact with Deadlock shooting mechanics. But this isn't a video about me designing my own hero, so I'm not going to spend the next 20 minutes doing that. Although, if you want to actually see me flesh this character out, let me know in the comments or come join me on Discord and we can design and theorycraft together. Another thing I'd love to see in the content update is more mechanics for the Guardians and Walkers, especially the Walkers. They're such an important part of the game, but I think there's a lot of potential to make them more interesting. I'm not entirely sure what the answer is yet, but I'd love to see these objectives have more going on other than the stomp and the fire bombs. They don't necessarily need to become incredibly complicated, but giving them some additional mechanics could make fighting around them so much more interesting. I'd also love to see another art pass on the map. Deadlock has already come a ridiculously long way visually, but there's still so many areas that are unfinished. There's still tons of placeholder textures, unfinished buildings, and areas that clearly haven't received their final level of detail. And that's completely understandable considering the game is still in development, but I think another big art pass would do wonders for making the world feel more complete. There are so many cool locations in Deadlock already, and I'd love to see the entire map get that same level of polish. And speaking of the map, mid needs some work. I think mid is one of the most boring areas of the map right now. And it's not necessarily because it's just a big open area. I actually don't mind that it's an open area. The problem is that that's all it is. It's just a giant open area. There's not enough interesting terrain or pathways to make fighting there particularly exciting. And I'd love to see them expand the underneath area of mid and add some additional pathways through it. Maybe they could also add jump pads on top of the rope buildings that let you travel from one to the other. And if they're worried about making mid too chaotic in the early game, maybe those jump pads only activate once the Guardian has been destroyed. That way, the early game in mid is still very straightforward, but once you've taken the Guardian, the area opens up and becomes much more dynamic. And I'm not saying that I have the perfect solution for mid, I just think it needs something, because right now, it's the least interesting area of the map. Now, this next one is more of a bug fix than more content, but it's so incredibly annoying that I have to talk about it. Please fix the hitboxes. The Bluetooth punches, getting hooked from Bebop around a corner, and even through walls, abilities that have visual effects that don't line up with their actual hitboxes. There are so many situations where something visually looks like it shouldn't hit you, and then it does. I was actually going to make an entire video about this exact topic, but while I was writing this video, a YouTuber that goes by Mr. Supply Drops released an amazing video about this exact problem. So I'm going to leave a link to that video in the description because honestly, he explains the issue way better than I could. The final major thing I want to see is another objective. Deadlock needs something that encourages team fights in areas that aren't just the side lanes during rift fights or in the mid-boss pit during, well, mid-boss. I've talked about this idea before, but I'm going to bring it up again, and I would absolutely love to see some kind of roaming mini-boss, something that actually moves around the jungle, and I think this could create some really interesting fights because the location of the objective would change every time. That means the same objective could create completely different fights depending on where it happens to be. And more importantly, it would give teams another reason to move around the map. Right now, so many of the major fights gravitate towards these two locations. And I'd love to see an objective that forces us to adapt where the fight is happening rather than always knowing exactly where the fight is going to be. And while we're on the topic of objectives, I also think the Rift area could use some changes. Personally, I'd like to see the Rift area expanded to cover the entire low ground section rather than having that giant circle area. The circle just doesn't really fit the terrain very well, and it feels like something that was just a quick solution while they were trying to figure out how to rework the urn. I'd rather see the objective have a much more natural and purposeful area using the terrain that's already there, instead of forcing this somewhat lazy feeling circular area that it currently is. That's what I'd like to see from the next two major updates in Deadlock. Obviously, some of these things are a bit more realistic than the others. More heroes and items? Very likely. A complete rework of the mid lane, a roaming mini-boss, and a giant overhaul to how ability charges work? Well, we'll see about that. But that's the fun part about Deadlock right now. The game is still being built, and there's so much more room for developers to experiment. But those are my ideas. What do you want to see in the next Deadlock updates? Let me know down in the comments, or come join me on Discord and we can talk about it. And if you haven't already, check out my video on reworking ability charges, because I go way more in depth on that system there. Anyways, thanks for watching, I'll see you in the next one. Okay, bye.